Sup, guys? So, I watched the series finale of Stranger Things recently, and I thought it was a very uneven end to a pretty lousy season. There have been worse ends to a TV show that I have seen, but I found it very, very underwhelming, and I left the show feeling like Stranger Things devolved over time and became something worse than it initially was. And I don't feel the need to do a full review on the ending because there are already a million of those on the internet, and if you pick one, I probably agree with it, unless it's offensive or something. But the one bit of analysis I do want to give about the end of Stranger Things is that, in my opinion, the primary reason this show ended badly is because this show got too big. And when I say big, I don't mean big as in popular, although you could make that case if you wanted to. I mean big as in scale. I watched the final episode of Stranger Things, and when I was watching it, I found myself thinking about a very specific Damon Lindelof quote from 2013, after he had written Star Trek Into Darkness, when he said that when you're making a really expensive fantasy movie, there's almost like an obligation to have the fate of the world be at stake, because the movie has to feel big more than anything. He said, quote, "Once you spend more than $100 million on a movie, you have to save the world. And when you start there and basically say, I have to construct a MacGuffin based on if they shut off this, or they close this portal, or they deactivate this bomb, or they come up with this cure, it will save the world," you are very limited in terms of how you execute that. And in many ways, you can become a slave to it. There is a sense of bigger, better, faster, seen it before, done that. And the irony of that quote, and the reason I've remembered it, is because that sense of, we've got to make the fate of the world be at stake at the end of this, is totally something that bit Lost, which Lindelof created. Lost was a show about people who survived a plane crash at first, but by the end of the show, it was about a fistfight to save the world from being destroyed. Lost overextended itself, and when I watched the series finale of Stranger Things, not only was there an invisible MacGuffin that could very conveniently destroy the entire Upside Down in a single attack, which was absolutely an example of them writing backwards, this was a supernatural mystery show that was about an abduction in a small town, and in the final episode of this show, the characters are on an alien planet and they're fighting a giant spider monster to decide the fate of humanity. And I watched this and I thought, this show got way too big. This show also overextended itself. It never should have gotten to this enormous scale. And the reason it got to this scale is because the people making this show were specifically trying to make it not like a TV show, but a movie. When the Duffer Brothers made the second season of Stranger Things, they had that season be called Stranger Things 2 as if it was a movie sequel, and they did the same thing to every subsequent season. And when they were interviewed about the second season of the show, they would say in those interviews that they wanted the second season of the show to feel bigger because, in their minds, that was what you're supposed to do with a movie sequel. You're supposed to up the ante. It's supposed to feel more important. They did an interview with Deadline in 2017 in which one of the Duffer Brothers said that the sequels that they were looking at for inspiration were James Cameron's sequels, and he said, quote, "I feel like James Cameron is the master of it. I mean, The Godfather Part 2 is a great movie, but not a great reference here just because we're looking at popcorn films and then big summer blockbusters and the successful sequels there." So the Duffer Brothers mindset very much became, how can we make these follow-up seasons feel like summer blockbusters? It became part of the DNA of the show that these follow-up seasons were supposed to be like big tentpole movie sequels. And by the end of the show, when Stranger Things was approaching its conclusion, the people making it were selling it by saying, look how big it is, look how huge its scale has gotten, look how incredibly epic it's gotten, this thing is enormous. Turning the show into a pop culture spectacle was by design. The Duffer Brothers wanted people to watch the final season as if it was the last of a series of movies. It's why the runtime of the final episodes are movie-length. They weren't trying to make television by the end of this show as much as they were trying to make very expensive Hollywood sequels. And when your show has the mindset of, this is like a movie, this is like a movie, this is like a big Hollywood movie, what invariably happens is you start to feel like you have to keep topping yourself. You have to keep making the show bigger and bigger and bigger. And when you do that and you never stop escalating, you take the small parts of the show that were its bread and butter and the thing that made it work, and you push it to the side out of necessity so you can focus instead on the things that are making it bigger. And so, in the final season of Stranger Things, the character development winds up being secondary to this behemoth of a story that had been established, in which the fate of the world is suddenly at stake. By the end of the show, Stranger Things is in this weird situation where the subplots between the main characters aren't getting enough time and are repeatedly being resolved in a single conversation, almost out of obligation more than anything, while the backstory of the villain is laboriously detailed again and again and again and again because Vecna had to become more important than everyone else. They had to allocate most of their attention onto him in order to make him feel like this Darth Vader, Freddy Krueger level villain that they had built up. But again, when you do that, when you go all in on, we're making this show big, you start to skip past the framework that was the real appeal of this show. There's a really weird subplot in the final season in which bullies are beating up Dustin and they're tormenting him and assaulting him, and the show never gets around to actually giving the bullies their comeuppance. They don't pay for it or learn their lesson or anything. It's just forgotten by the end. Dustin doesn't even care by the end. And the reason it's forgotten is because the show had gotten so big that it couldn't organically get around to addressing it, in the same way it couldn't organically get around to addressing many other parts of the show. The character development became a math equation to get to the big parts of the show. And when you're making concessions like that, when the character development is not the primary draw of your story anymore, you're not making the best story you can make. Stranger Things, to me, is a casualty of the summer blockbuster mindset that I referenced earlier. And it's such a shame because if the Duffers hadn't tried to make it into a series of movies and had accepted this show as a television show, they could have taken more advantage of this medium and made a much better product. Because the beauty of television is that it allows you to be more granular and devote more attention to your characters and your setting than you could ever do in a movie. And you can do it without having to keep making your show bigger and bigger and more epic. For example, one of my favorite shows of all time is Batman the Animated Series. I think it's probably the best Batman anything that's ever been made. And one of the reasons it works so well, to me, is that almost every episode of the show is small. There's almost no episode in the entire series that's really, really big. The fate of the world is almost never at stake in it. Whereas, if you look at all the superhero blockbusters that have ever been made, they're almost exclusively huge in scale. They're almost all really, really big. And that's not to say, by the way, that something being big is a bad thing necessarily. There are lots of stories that are big that are great. But when every superhero movie has to be big, that means that all the great small superhero stories that are also out there can never be adapted into a movie. And that's why something like Batman the Animated Series was great, because it was a TV show that knew it was a TV show and that it could tell stories that Batman movies weren't gonna do. And I think of that in regard to Stranger Things because if you go back and watch the first season of the show, immediately after watching the end of it, one of the first things you're going to notice is how many great scenes there are in that first season that are small, that are chock full of idiosyncrasies and minutia and care that make it feel more real and gripping than anything you see in the last season. Everything's better in the first season. The writing is better, the lighting is better, the pacing is less frantic. There are moments when something important is happening and there isn't music playing the whole time that's trying to hurry you to the next scene. It's not just that season 1 felt like a show that knew what it was, it's that so many of the great moments in season 1 could never ever be in season 5 because they would have been too small for season 5. By the time Stranger Things had gotten to its 5th and final season, it was about the world being at risk and Vecna and all this other giant stuff. They wouldn't have been able to include some of the great, quieter scenes of season 1 even if they'd wanted to, because it would have been too much of a divergence. When your show has a giant demon spider in it on an alien planet, that has to take precedence over everything. And in order for the show to install the Mind Flayer as a giant demon spider at the very end, so much of what made this show great in the beginning, when the stakes were smaller, had to be left in the dust. And that's why, if you do a rewatch of this show after watching the ending, I think what you're going to find is that in every subsequent season of the show, more and more and more of its identity got peeled away from it. And it started to become this newer thing that the Duffer Brothers wanted it to become. And by the time the show was done, Stranger Things was very different from how it used to be. Like, it's not just that the last season is worse than the first season, it's that they feel like they're from totally different shows. And so, it only makes all the sense in the world, in hindsight, that Stranger Things would have a bad ending. Because how do you make the show bigger and bigger and bigger and properly wrap up the smaller parts of the show in a way that's satisfying? I would argue that they couldn't, and that's why, in my opinion, they didn't. And I think the moral of Stranger Things is that not everything is meant to be big. Not everything is meant to be this gigantic, epic, cinematic spectacle. I think about how one of the only prestige shows that has ever had an ending that people generally agree is good is Breaking Bad. And I think one of the reasons why is because the end of Breaking Bad isn't that big. Like, yeah, the stakes had escalated, but it wasn't like someone was in Walter White's ear and was like, Walt, you have to cook the greatest meth the world has ever seen in the next 10 minutes, or we're gonna have to blow up New Mexico. Like, it still felt like Breaking Bad was within the range of where the show was meant to be. I believe that every show has a natural built-in limit to how big it should get and how much it should expand. And when I watched the final episode of Stranger Things, all I could think about is how if you only watched the first season of the show and then you were shown the clip of Eleven jumping at the Mind Flayer in the finale, you couldn't believe it's from the same show. You'd be like, what happened to the show I was watching? What is this? And I think someone's ability to enjoy this ending largely comes down to how much they enjoyed what Stranger Things transformed into over time and how along for the ride they were, no matter what. And if they were, then, hey, more power to them. But if you're like me and you revisit season 1 and just sort of take stock in how much worse the writing and the dialogue and so many core elements of this show became over time, I think you'll come to the same conclusion I did, which is that Stranger Things didn't remotely need to be in this setting. And that if it hadn't stopped trying to be a television show, I think we'd be talking about a much better ending. But we're not, so this video gets to exist.